Welcome to Down Low with BassDerek, and today we are going to ask the question, is premium build quality worth the price? In front of me here, I've got the Handheld, the AYANEO Pocket S. I purchased this particular unit with my own money, and I've had it for about a month now as my daily driver. The styling here is heavily reminiscent of the iPhone 4 or 5 of yesteryear. Pricing originally started at $400 for the 1080p model and $440 for the 1440p model. The prices go all the way up to the eye-watering $753 for the special unmarked edition of the 1440p Pocket S. Really all the unmarked means is that these ABXY buttons here just don't have labels on them. The Pocket S comes with the Snapdragon G3x Gen 2 chip, which shares a similar base architecture and CPU speeds to the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, alongside an updated and allegedly more powerful GPU. The Pocket S can reach a higher peak performance, but unfortunately, due to the cooling in the device, it really can't sustain that, and after 20 minutes of play or so, you're looking at basically the same performance, which isn't to say this is any slouch. There is just as much performance on tap here as any other top-tier Android device. Other specs do include either 12 or 16 gigabytes of RAM, between 128 gigabytes and 1 terabyte of internal storage, and a 6-inch screen that is either a 2560 by 1440 or 1920 by 1080p resolution. That is a 60 hertz screen, and they do claim 100% sRGB coverage. It does have Hall effect triggers on the device. Hall effect joysticks, they are a switch size. I put my Skull & Co caps on here because I really like that, but let me take those off so you can see what those joysticks look like when they don't have any cap on them. And we'll show a little bit more of the specs on the screen here in terms of what exactly you can expect out of this device. Now that we've gotten the details out of the way, let's jump into the ergonomics and controls of the device. Some people might be disappointed by the lack of protruding grips here. Personally, I've really grown to enjoy that, and I have an overall positive view of the device's ergonomics. I think when you talk about how much grip is needed on a device, you really do have to consider the overall shape and weight as well. When you have a lighter device, you don't really have to have huge ergonomic grips in order to keep the device steady and comfortable in your hands. You know, there are rounded corners here, and overall it kind of fits well into the palms. If you don't mind using a Switch or a Switch Lite, you'll have no problems with this device, I think. If you do have bigger hands and you really prefer those chunky grips, well, this might not be the device for you. As I mentioned previously, we do have Hall effect triggers in the device, kind of wrap around the corner and give a little bit of this angular motion as you depress them. But I do find they really kind of nicely fit into that little crook of my finger here as I'm holding the device. I don't have any complaints about them. They're relatively smooth. Pull up the tester here and just take a quick look. You can see here that we get a full range all the way from 0 to 100%, hitting a lot of values in between on both the left and right trigger. They might be a little sensitive if you're doing like some high-end racing game streaming or something like that, but I've never had an issue with them, and I think they do feel pretty good overall. By default, you get this nice circular range on the sticks, and there's a good amount of sensitivity here that you can move through the range. You don't have any cardinal snapping issues here like you might have on something like the Anbernic RG556. Overall, these Hall effect joysticks are pretty good. We do have a couple sensitivity options. If we dive into the controller menu here, we can go to the joystick sensitivity and we can set that to 150% if we want to see that square style input, and you do sacrifice some sensitivity, but we do get that option at least. We do have here the toggle they call the range adjustment, which is really just a dead zone. You turn it off and you get little fine control movements on the joysticks, but if they don't return perfectly to center, it can be kind of annoying, so I typically leave that on. Face buttons here are really one of the stars of the show for me. You know, clearly they're inspired by the PlayStation Vita, and they have a really nice tactile feel. They are a membrane button, they're not loud, they're not overly clicky. And while they're pretty small, they still feel pretty comfortable because of the fact that they have kind of a slight dome to them. I really see no issues at all with those buttons, and they're really pretty much a joy to use. If you look at some of AYANEO's other handheld devices, like this Air Plus here, and the same follows for the Air and Air 1S series, you know, they have these squared off edges that can kind of get uncomfortable after button mashing for a little while. So I really appreciate that on this device, but we do have those more rounded buttons that are a lot more comfortable to use. We can move on to the D-pad, which, man, D-pads are something that the community loves and hates, and Handheld can live or die by personal opinions. A disclaimer, I am not even really good at D-pad games. I'm awful at Celeste, so maybe you can call me a filthy casual. This D-pad is good for me. They did fix some initial issues, I believe there were, with the false diagonals. And you can see here that if I press down and rock a little bit, I really don't get a whole much. I have to be more vigorous to get that. And same goes for any of the 4 directions, you know, small movements and then large movements you can see. And you can easily kind of circle around the D-pad here. You can hit diagonals when you need to hit diagonals. The worst part about this D-pad is the fact that it can collapse if you press it in the center. So if you're somebody that holds your thumb in the center and rolls around, that might feel gross for you and you might hate the D-pad. For me, I tend to go around the outside edges and this is not an issue. On the top, we have AYANEO's LC and RC buttons, which I personally like. By default in Android, RC is the back button, which I find super handy because then you don't have to get your screen all smudgy or do gestures. And the LC button opens up a task switcher so you can scroll through your recent apps. A lot of people want those to be bindable. That is not the case. I'm sorry to tell you. AYANEO has said that it might be coming. I don't know if I would hold your breath for that. And they are perfectly fine as is. You get the volume rocker here and your fingerprint/power button, which makes it pretty convenient to just unlock your device without having to use a pin. L bumper and right bumper, they feel nice. They are membrane. They're not loud or anything like that. So overall pleasant to use. Start and select. Please, 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 please move your start and select buttons up top here where they're supposed to go. I don't really like that AYANEO puts them on the bottom left here. I think maybe Retroid does them on the bottom right on some devices. I just kind of find it annoying and it makes hotkey combos in games that use the select and start for gameplay a little tricky. On the bottom right, you get the AYANEO buttons. This one on the right that looks kind of like an equal sign brings you back to the home screen. And this one on the left here brings up your quick menu for your settings, and a long press opens up the IS-based software. In terms of any other inputs, on the right here, we do have this slider that will toggle into game or max performance mode. To be honest, I accidentally bump this all the time while I am holding it and it puts it in a higher performance mode, which kind of annoys me, but that may just be how I palm the device personally, so that might not be an issue for everyone. On the left side here, you do have your micro SD card slot, and you can put your card in there. I currently have a 1 terabyte card. You've got your exhaust for the cooling here. I think this is a hard reset button in a power LED. And then on the bottom, you get your USB-C port. This is full featured, supports DisplayPort, as well as you can use it with a hub or charger. You got 2 downfiring speakers and the air intake here. Lastly, we do have this, I think it's an Xbox guide button or home button here. You can see that represents the guide button in the tester. I guess if you're doing Xbox streaming or some other applications, it can be useful. I personally don't find a use for it at all, and I really wish that was a select button. So let's talk about the star of the show on this device, the 1440p display. I'm sure most of the critiques I have here will apply to the 1080p other than the resolution-based stuff. So just keep in mind that this portion of the video is focused around what we will get out of that 1440p. You know, when playing retro games, this resolution is actually one of the more optimal choices. 1440p has a lot of great integer scaling options where we have minimal black borders. I'm personally of the mindset that once you reach a high enough resolution, integer scale starts to matter a little bit less, since you don't really notice those weird alignment issues like you would on a low resolution display. Having this resolution with the horsepower that we do have on tap here also means that we can use some pretty awesome shaders in RetroArch, and I really do think for Game Boy Advance these shaders do look pretty incredible. I mean, if I can get really close here, you can see how you have that perfect grid and no weird integer scaling issues going on there. So here we have a really nice CRT shader, and let's see if I can get it in close so you can really see how that looks. And I'll take a screenshot of this and put it up on the screen. As far as colors go on this display, I generally find them pretty pleasing and overall nicely saturated. They're not overly saturated, but they're also not washed out. Another thing to note about the display that the community has noticed, there is a bit of a dimness along this right edge that kind of has a gradient in. It's definitely apparent at more of an angle. It doesn't bother me. And I'm picky about displays. I'm the person that said, I don't like the Odin 2 because it has ghosting on it, which is a highly controversial opinion. I do see this in some scenarios, but it's typically only on a white screen. I never notice it in gaming. It's there. If you're a perfectionist, maybe that'll drive you nuts, but I don't think it's that bad. Overall though, I really do enjoy this display. The colors pop, the contrast is reasonable. You know, black levels might not be perfect. I don't think it's outside the range of what an IPS normally produces. You know, I suppose we all wish there was an OLED panel in here, you know, myself included. I think for what it is, this 1440p is super awesome. It's great for retro gaming. It gives you that crispy integer scaling, so there's not a whole lot for me to complain about. Let's talk about the speakers for a moment here. I have owned several AYANEO devices in the past, and unfortunately I can say from personal experience that audio is not their strong suit. The speakers on the Pocket S are actually clearer than previous AYANEO devices like the Pocket Air or most of the x86 Air series. Those do tend to have this kind of like mid-range honk or mud in them that really, unfortunately affects the clarity in a negative way. But the clarity is a lot better on this device. There's just really no low end or bass, which, considering the size of the device and these small downfiring speakers, I guess we're not surprised there. It's clear enough for retro emulation. It's tolerable. I know a lot of people, myself included, were a little bit concerned with how thin the device is and how small the fan is when it comes to cooling. We do get control here under the Performance tab in our quick settings menu that we can do a off, low, high, or max setting. Perhaps you can hear a little bit what that max setting sounds like. But the bottom line is the fan doesn't really do anything. Several users have done tests that, running between low, off, or high fan makes almost no difference in the performance. It's eventually just going to throttle anyways if you are doing something like switch emulation that is really demanding. So I personally just leave it on low and never touch it. It's a little disappointing the fan doesn't cool the device better. I'm not saying it has no impact at all, but it's really only a couple degrees, and it also depends on what performance profile you are using on the device. Which is to say, for performance, which we haven't talked about yet, this device does what it needs to do. And I leave it actually on this balance mode here 98% of the time when I'm playing games. And I can really play everything up to PS2 and GameCube on that setting. Sometimes I do occasionally need to bump the GPU clocks up just a little bit in the settings if it's a more demanding title. But for most games, I really don't find it to be an issue. I almost never use the gamer max mode. This area down here at the bottom left when doing PS2 and GameCube isn't too bad. It does get a little warm. And even Switch emulation of 2D titles, lighter indie titles, it doesn't get much warmer than that either. But if you're going to play a Switch game or a native Android game that is really demanding and you bump it up to max, this area right here, and to a lesser extent, the back of the device and this metal rim here, do get pretty hot. I'm not gonna say it's gonna burn you, but I don't really find it comfortable to play. And you can put the grip case on to kind of distance yourself a little bit from the heat. But unfortunately, it is what it is with that metal band and the thin design and the small fan and the device. All right, so let's take a quick look at the performance modes. And we've got a few here: saving, balance, game, and max. The saving is going to try to keep the clocks down, maximize performance, though I think some people have run into maybe some small audio glitches in emulation with that. Balance mode, which I leave it on most of the time, is going to try to raise the clocks to the demand that's necessary, and it's going to keep the GPU here, I think at a preset 680 megahertz, which again, good enough for most things. The only thing that I really do sometimes is I'll bump up this slider. If I'm going to do some heavy PS2 or GameCube games, sometimes I need 700, 750 megahertz to make sure it's perfectly smooth. I pretty much never need to max it out at the full 1 gigahertz speed. Game mode here is going to raise the respective clocks that are default and put it in a performance CPU scheduling mode, which essentially just keeps it at those max clock settings as they are limited. And then the max mode, which really is just gonna put everything to the max. As it says, every CPU core, the fan, the GPU, they're all going to be on the maximum settings, but the device can get pretty toasty in that mode, so it's not really something I choose to use. So let's talk a little bit more about the software here. As I've mentioned before, you've seen in this video, we've got this quick menu here, which is something I really like that AYANEO does. I think it's better than some of the other manufacturers' quick menus or lack of quick menus whatsoever. You get your performance and fan modes. You can toggle this performance overlay up top with that, and you can actually drag that anywhere you want on the screen. You get the controller menu, which you saw earlier when I was looking at the sensitivity. We've got key mapping here, which only is available when you're in an Android game to do on-screen key mapping. The vibration strength of the device. Sound tap magic, which takes the audio stream and generates rumble from that. I find it of limited use. Some people like to mess around with that. Key vibration is just like haptics. I leave that off. Analog trigger, linear mode, or key mode. This is kind of just whether these triggers do a full analog range or whether they're just a digital on and off, in a sort of Nintendo Switch style. And you have sensitivity adjustments here to make them more sensitive if you want. I don't know why you'd want to do that. I think the throw is small enough that 100% sensitivity is probably where you want to be. We talked already about the sensitivity of the joysticks in the range. We've got the ABXY mode, which allows you to do the Nintendo Switch or just Nintendo in general style layout, swapping the A, B, and XY paired buttons. We've got the gyro, which allows us to map the gyro to the right stick. And then custom here, you can do some remapping of some of the keys on the device. Handheld here, we've got your basics like the brightness, volume, airplane, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, RGB light. You'll notice I've had them off the entire time for the video. There's some pretty cool effects that you've got here, but I'm one of those people that just doesn't want RGB on their devices. I don't want to waste the battery, and it's distracting when I'm playing games. We've got some widgets here. I believe within the iSpace software, you can add a few more, and then some settings that just bring you to the update menus. So, you know, talking about the software, there's a couple things I want to talk about. It's not always perfect, and there are bugs that they introduce sometimes with updates. But I will say that AYANEO is consistently pushing way more updates to the Pocket S than they ever did to the Pocket Air. None of the bugs personally have really hampered my ability to enjoy and play games on the system. Because we do have the iSpace software, which does have a front end, and it has been getting updates to allegedly be able to import your emulation station information as well as a few other platforms. And you can see here that I did import some of my stuff, but unfortunately it doesn't carry over the artwork that I had already scraped through ESDE. And there is a way to rename the artwork to make it work with this, but it's really tedious, and I just don't know if it's worth the effort yet to be able to use this launcher built in. I'm really excited to see them, you know, potentially improve this and build in some better importing so that you can use the artwork that you've already gone through and scraped without having to kind of manually go in and rename those files. You can also just pin the individual emulators or apps up here. You see I've got just a couple, you know, commonly used things pinned up here for my perusal. It does have some customization options. If I click in R3 here, you can do a banner and kind of get a different little layout there. So you can just launch your Android apps directly from here. You can use other launcher apps like Console Launcher, Square Home, etc. to customize your home screen. But I've just found that the built-in launcher, it works fine for what I need to do. And most of the time for emulation, I just spend my time in ESDE. Okay, so let's talk about retro emulation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on 16-bit systems. All these lower end systems are going to run perfectly fine on the device. You can run high-res CRT shaders. I like to play PSP at 6x. It's super nice and crispy. Doesn't really push the system at all, so that's great. I'm going to start the conversation with the GameCube and PS2. Both of these are systems that run fine. I'm not going to go into super deep dive technical analysis of each and every game and what the performance is. All right, so first we'll jump in with a little bit of GameCube here, and I'll show you my settings. Under enhancements at Dolphin, we are running an internal resolution 4x native for 2560 by 2112. You know, we'd probably be fine at 3x native as that's giving us 1584 vertical, but I'm just going to round it up to 4x. That way we can make sure it is nice and crispy. And as you can see here, the Pocket S really has no issues running this game in that resolution. And some games run even easier than this. This is, I believe, SSX 3, just something I picked up to do a quick test for. All right, so hopping over to God of War on PS2. This game I've actually been playing through. This has seen more playtime than anything else on the Pocket S, because I think it's a great fit for the hardware. So I'm not actually just testing this, I'm really playing it. So if we take a quick look at what I'm doing for graphics, and this is in Nether SX, the most recent build. I'm doing a 3.5x native, and the reason I chose that particular resolution is if you can see here, we're running at a 1792 by 1568 resolution, which is at least as much as the vertical pixels of the display here. I am using the native widescreen option of the game, not the hack, so it is stretching the horizontal pixels a little bit, but it's not really noticeable. If I wanted to, I could crank the resolution higher, but you know, honestly, I don't think I'd really be able to see the difference, and then we're just gonna add more heat and power consumption to the device. All right, let's show a little bit of footage where we've actually got some mobs going on so we can show off this display a little bit better. Pardon my sloppy playing as I'm trying to play and record here at the same time. All right, let's talk about the Unspeakable emulator for a moment here. Overall performance is pretty good. There's some 3D games that are going to have some glitches, but we do have turnip drivers now that are a little bit better than what we had a couple months ago. There's some games that you might still see some crashing in, but there are other games where the turnip drivers work just fine. Some games run fine on the default Qualcomm drivers. but may have some artifacting, but it may help it from crashing. Unfortunately, emulation here is not in a perfect state, and it's going to be similar on other consoles, although I believe the drivers for Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 are a little bit more tuned on something like the Odin 2. But, my favorite thing to do here is play these lightweight 2D indie games, and is really quite enjoyable. This form factor is really just perfect for this type of game. And, the chip has absolutely no problem at all playing these kinds of games. Lastly, I'm going to talk real quick here about Android gaming. Of course, you've got the gacha games like Zenless Zone Zero, Genshin Impact, and others that all run perfectly fine on this chip and offer, a really fun gameplay experience sometimes. Although with, those kind of gambling and time gate mechanics, that can be a big turnoff for some. But I've really been having some fun with some other titles like Skull here that are native Android games. And, they run really well. And even though they don't need the performance that this chip has necessarily, they are a lot of fun and support native Android controls. So you don't have to use the screen mapper. So you got Skull here, you've got Dead Cells, Horizon Chase Turbo. There's a good amount of Android games that are pretty fun and play great and look great on the screen. Of course, these games could also run on something like even a Retroid Pocket 3 Plus. Obviously maybe not quite this awesome 6-inch 1440p display. Let me show off a few I have here as well. Grim Valor is an older one, but I never really got into it when it first came out. I don't even know if I had an Android device at the time. So it's a fun little hack and slash side scrolling, a 3D element type of kind of ARPG. So, that is a lot of fun. We also have the venerable classics. Another hidden gem I like here is Dwarf Journey, which is a nice little roguelite. It's got a nice little sense of progression as you do each run, gathering some materials that you can then use to upgrade your stuff, and it natively supports controls on Android. So, that is always really a great thing to see here. All right, it's that time of the video where we wrap everything up and give a few final thoughts on the AYANEO Pocket S. On the positive side of things, we've got a few items to mention here, first and foremost being the display on this device. The 1440p model particularly provides an abundance of resolution to make retro games appear very crisp, as well as providing a great platform for using shaders. The face buttons are one of the big highlights for me. They have a great tactility and are not fatiguing to use and look great as well. There's lots of performance on tap as long as you can deal with the warmth of the device when you're really pushing it. And perhaps most importantly for me, the device is thin and light and pretty comfortable to play on. Over on the negative side of the spectrum, we have the fact that the device can get uncomfortable to hold when really pushing its performance ceiling, barely average audio quality, a D-pad that may not feel good for some, and the uncertainty that at any point a software update might have a negative impact on the use of the device. One last section I want to add here, which is considerations. So these are items that aren't necessarily good or bad, but may be deciding factors for buying the handheld. The first being the switch size sticks. I personally think they are appropriate, but for some they are a compromise, and considering the price of the device may not be satisfactory. Another factor to mention is the fact that both PS2 and Switch emulation have mostly stalled out on Android at this point. There are plenty of playable games in their catalogs, but especially with Switch, there are some games with graphical glitches or unplayability that may never be resolved. And even though it's a bit of apples and oranges, it's worth mentioning that in this price bracket, you can secure an x86 handheld of similar performance, but likely with trade-offs in size, weight, and battery life. If you don't already have another handheld or a PC at home, it might make more sense to start with something like the Steam Deck or ROG Ally. As a secondary handheld, the Pocket S does make a lot more sense. Finally, price may be a factor that drives people away from this device. At the starting spec, it's not too far out of line for what you'd pay for a similarly spec'd Odin 2, but AYN has made the base model of the Odin 2 very hard to beat on a price per performance metric. However, there are still plenty of reasons to prefer the Pocket S based on size, weight, and screen quality. On the topic of other devices, I would say that the Odin 2 and Odin 2 Mini are the devices that would be considered direct competition. The Odin 2 Mini might make more sense if you value ultimate portability, but you are trading off an inch of screen size, which is a noticeable difference. If you are okay with sacrificing some performance, but still playing a lot of the GameCube and PS2 catalogs with at least 2x upscaling, then the Retroid Pocket 4 and AYANEO Pocket Air are reasonable alternatives at a potentially lower price point. Finally, if you only care about screen, the Anbernic RG556 has a beautiful 5.5-inch OLED screen, but may only achieve native resolution for much of the GameCube and PS2 catalog. It also suffers from some poor sensitivity and cardinal snapping on the joysticks, but is the cheapest option out of everything I've mentioned here. Well, that's all for this video. I appreciate each and every one of you that stuck around to listen to my thoughts, and happy gaming!